Hello everyone and welcome to this week's Information Studies 752 Outreach Lecture, Introduction to Online Access. So this is the first of a multi-week dive that we'll be taking into different forms of online access and how they connect to some of the issues that we have been discussing throughout this course, some of which we'll touch on today, and we'll also go into more detail with as we talk about online collections and online finding aids. So here are our weekly topics. How do reference and outreach considerations influence how archives provide access to archival materials? How can online access benefit researchers? And how can archives advocate for the support of online access? So we'll start by talking about the overlap between a few of the topics that we have been discussing in this course. So outreach, researcher services, and now online access. And they do have some commonalities. So for instance, with all three, the use of materials should be documented. And the impact that these processes that archives engage in should be documented as well. And we'll talk more about measuring impact later on. So definitely during outreach, you can talk about the use that other people have made of your materials, and that demonstrates how they are valuable and why they might be valuable to potential researchers that maybe haven't visited the archive before or may not be familiar with archives or the value that archives provide. With researcher services, you'll want to, as we've talked about, make sure that you are aware of which collections are being used in your archives, how they're being used, if the collections are meeting researcher expectations. And again, having these use statistics, whether it's direct use or indirect use, can demonstrate the value of your archives and why your archives should be supported. And with online access, kind of relatedly, it's important to have some idea how online access to your materials is translating into uses of your archives materials and the impacts that those uses might be having on society. All three of these processes require planning and the establishment of goals. So you just don't want to engage in any of these processes on an ad hoc kind of unplanned basis. And a part of that planning, as we've talked about throughout this course, is determining what your goals are. So what are your goals for your social media? What are your goals for your researcher services? What are your goals for the different types of online access that you provide? And these should be a starting point for the development and refinement of these different services. All three of these processes require knowledge of the people that they are being aimed at. So when you're doing outreach, it's helpful to know who you are trying to reach, and you can use that as a basis for structuring your outreach in a particular way. For researcher services, you should have some idea of who is or who might be using your repository and structure your researcher services in a way that supports their needs as researchers and their information seeking behavior. And for online access as well, it's important to know who might be using your online resources and structure them in a way that supports their needs as researchers and how they seek out information to meet their information need. all three should involve evaluation. So you should evaluate how well your outreach is doing, how well you are meeting the targets that you've set, how well you're reaching out to the people that you've identified as priorities for your outreach. We've talked about the importance of evaluating researcher services through things like researcher surveys to make sure that those are being implemented in a way that supports researchers and researcher needs. And the same is true for online access. You need to be constantly evaluating how well your online resources are meeting the needs of researchers and how well they are meeting the needs of researchers and matching the information seeking behavior of researchers. All three of these processes involve archival infrastructure, in some ways, significant archival infrastructure. And as we move through our discussion of the types of online access that we'll be discussing in this course, we'll talk more specifically about what types of infrastructure they require. We've already talked about the types of infrastructure required for researcher services and outreach, but none of these are free ride, and they do involve an investment of resources, and that really emphasizes the need for planning and establishing goals and evaluating how well these processes are going and where there's room for improvement. So just to talk about some of the overlaps between the three main subjects of this course. So in the first part of the course, we talked about outreach, then we moved into a discussion of researcher services, and now we'll be moving into online access, and they're all connected and they all have areas of overlap and similarities. So what do we talk about when we are talking about online access, online digital collections, and online finding aids? So we'll spend a couple of weeks looking at digital collections and connecting them to some of the concepts that we've talked about in this course. And then we'll wrap things up with a discussion of online finding aids and also connecting that to some of our course topics as well. So those two areas of study combined comprise the online access discussion that we will be having in this course. So online access involves compromise on the part of archivists. While it may result in archives being more distant from researchers that are using archival resources and perhaps less aware of the uses that are being made of those resources because there may not be as much of an interaction between a researcher looking at an online finding aid from their home or working with an online collection as there is when a researcher is in the reading room looking at a finding aid, or in the reading room looking at collection material, right in front of an archivist. So there is some isolation between the researcher and between the archives, and as I touched on, that can have some slightly negative consequences for the archives. The archive may not develop as much of a rapport with researchers because there isn't a face-to-face interaction going on. There may be no interaction between a person that works in an archive and a researcher at all. So there can be kind of that loss of connection and rapport, and that may make it less likely that a researcher is going to feel really invested or involved with an archive, and therefore they may be less willing or not as likely to advocate for the archive in the future. But there are definitely some benefits as well. Um, as the Green and Lampron article notes on page 761, online access can prompt new uses of materials by new researchers. It can really expand the base of researchers that an archive has, and also expand the potential uses of archival materials. So as records become more accessible, more people ideally use them, and that may result in archival materials being used in diverse ways. And obviously, having more people using or interacting with archival materials is an important fact or impact that an archives can mention when advocating for resources. So as something becomes more convenient and as it's more accessible to people, that may result in people using archives collections that were previously unable to do so because maybe the archive is in on the West Coast and they're on the East Coast, and it would just be really expensive or difficult to fly there and look at the materials or interact with materials how they wanted and needed. And so once these barriers are reduced and researchers can access materials online, obviously that ups the convenience factor. That's not to say that materials that aren't online are completely inaccessible to researchers. You can always go through a proxy researcher or have a reference archivist send you copies of records, but that can certainly take time and effort as well. So that can also limit the ability of people to access and interact with records. But when things are online, when those barriers are broken down, it can really facilitate more use of archival materials. Assuming, as we'll talk about later on in this course, that online collections and online findings are developed in a way that facilitates use and doesn't result in researchers wanting to pull out their hair and, swear to sell their firstborn child before they ever set foot in or say a nice thing about an archive. So, online access is great, but only to the extent that it's actually done well and done in a way that, again, meets researcher needs and the information seeking behavior of researchers. One benefit that online access can have is it can provide what the Green and Lampron article quoting Ricardo Punzalan describe as virtual reunification, or the strategy of reassembling physically dispersed heritage collections to produce a consolidated digitized representation of scattered artifacts, literary and artistic works, and or archival records of a single origin or common provenance. So online access can be especially convenient when it takes resources that might be connected to one person and provide access to those scattered resources in one convenient spot. So oftentimes collections get split, records get split between different archives, and so the idea of virtual reunification is that there's some way for researchers to be able to access these records or access information about these records in one convenient one-stop shopping. And again, this is something that can help people do research and make them feel like archives are providing value to their lives. If an archive allows a person to access all of the archival records related to Frank Lloyd Wright, as opposed to that person having to track them down through different archives and maybe go to a bunch of different archives online collections or visit a bunch of archives in person. That can be a really valuable tool that archives can provide. And something like this can really demonstrate the utility and value of archives and the ways that archives can make the lives of researchers easier. And I don't know about you, but I love it when things make my life easier. And researchers are certainly no exception. So the Green and Lepron article notes that projects engaging in virtual reunification not only enable the virtual reconstruction of cultural heritage, but enable vastly enhanced general access and enable greatly enhanced revelation of both the intellectual and physical elements of collections. So not only are you unifying all these collections in one convenient online hub or online resource, but you're also providing a greater contextual picture of how all these collections fit together and how these collections are related to each other. And that can certainly help people have a greater understanding and appreciation of the topic that they're researching or the records that they're looking at, which again can be a really valuable tool for archives to provide. One thing about virtual reunification is that it really relies on cross-institutional and interdisciplinary collaboration. And this is certainly related to one of the types of infrastructure that we talked a lot about in this course, which is the relationships that an archive has with other organizations or individuals. So this kind of project can be something that can result from those relationships. If you have a relationship with an archive that collects material from the same records creator as your archive does, if you have a relationship with that archive, you may put your heads together and say, wow, how can we unify all these materials in one way that will really benefit our researchers? Or it may be that something like this is a great way to develop those relationships. When you're talking about interdisciplinary collaboration, it might be that archives are working with historians or sociologists or anthropologists or really any number of fields to learn more about how different collections are related to each other and provide that information to researchers. So there are a whole lot of things that archives can do to develop relationships with other individuals and organizations, and it may well be the case that having these kinds of relationships in the first place makes it far more likely for something like virtual reunification to take place. It's interesting to think about how some of the outreach tools that we've discussed could incorporate some type of virtual reunification. So the first one that pops into my head is an exhibit. So you could have an exhibit about a particular topic and then have a page of the exhibit be a hub of information that connects to other collections related to the exhibit topic, maybe publications related to the exhibit topic, and that can certainly be beneficial for researchers and just the general public looking at that exhibit. It's not something that you obviously want to require people or make people look at, but if they want to go into a deeper dive into the exhibit topic, then here you are providing them with a bunch of rich contextual information that that they can use as they would like. A website might be a place to have some kind of virtual reunification, even if it's just, here is a subject that our archive has holdings in. Here are links to our online finding aids related to this subject or this person. Here are links to other finding aids from other archives, and that can be a form of virtual reunification as well. Maybe you could do something with social media. So, there are a whole bunch of things that we've already talked about that could be incorporated to harness the idea and the potential of virtual reunification. And it's definitely something that you can apply to online access as well in the form of online finding aids and online collections. Another thing about this idea of virtual reunification is that it can remove some of the barriers or constraints imposed by archivists via online access systems. And this is something that the Keteler article for this week talks about. So rather than having an online system that is really structured and regimented, you are providing researchers with a bunch of links and discovery tools and contextual information that they can use to kind of branch off and choose their own adventure. And as Keteler also notes, having really robust connections between online resources supports the ability of archives to find information that solves their information need. It really supports a researcher's freedom of interpretation. Rather than having the archive saying, this is what something is, it provides, virtual reunification provides researchers with more of a way to, again, interpret things their way and find information that solves their information need, as opposed to kind of being forced to interact with information that an archive thinks might solve someone's information need. So it just provides more of a kind of individualistic and boutique experience for researchers that are interested in consulting a lot of different sources to find the information that they're looking for. So you could definitely connect the idea of virtual reunification with berry picking, and the idea that rather than having just one bush and saying, okay, this is all the information out there, saying, here's our bush, here are the berries on our bush, but here are a bunch of other bushes that might be helpful for you to look at as well, in case these other sources of information are equally useful to you or perhaps more useful to you than what we have provided here. And, offering that service to researchers can be a really powerful thing and something that researchers will likely appreciate in the future. An important thing to consider about online access is that collaboration is an important resource for archives to harness. As Green and Lempron note on page 763, as specialized digital collections expanding content and structural design, scholars contribute important expertise in selection, collocation, interpretation, and integration of the sources that they study. So again, this idea of developing relationships with other individuals and leveraging those relationships into having more of an idea of what types of records might be selected for an online collection, how records might be described or communicated to researchers in online finding aid. Just to think of a couple of uh, benefits that a collaboration between archives and scholars and other researchers can have. And collaboration can also go a long way towards identifying the needs that researchers have when they work with online collections or online finding aids. And this might help archives to develop online finding aids and online collections in a way which supports researcher needs and uh, supports the information seeking behavior that researchers exhibit. So this is definitely related to some of the researcher surveys and studies that we've talked about. Actually working with people to identify what they want to see in online finding aids and online collections, and uh, as much as you can, implementing the needs and suggestions that researchers have into the online resources that you're providing, rather than just having archivists saying, oh, we know what researchers want, here's what it is. Having a collaborative relationship where you're listening to your users, you're listening to researchers and finding out what they think is important and what records they want to see online, and how online access tools might be developed in a way that supports their research and their needs. And as the Green and Lampron article notes on pages 761 and 762, if archives don't collaborate with researchers and collaborate with people who are or may well be using online resources, all the effort that they're putting into providing online access to records and developing online access tools might be wasted. If you are creating online access resources that just frustrate people or turn them off and make them not want to use archives, then you're spending a lot of money to convince people that your institution isn't valuable and and isn't able to meet their needs, which certainly seems like a poor use of resources to me. So again, when you're thinking about virtual reunification and what that looks like, or thinking about some of the other opportunities that online access can provide, it's always helpful to work with scholars and say, okay, which collections do you think are important to link together under this topic? Or, what subjects are related to this person that might be helpful for us to connect either in an online finding aid or via our online collections. What are these relationships like? How can you help us develop them and describe them to the people that are using repositories? And not only might this result in your archives having online tools that are better developed and are more able to meet the needs of scholars and researchers and just general users of archives, but it can also help your archives develop a relationship with scholars and other people that might benefit in your archives in the future. It might result in some good referrals. It might result in the researchers themselves being more likely to use your archive or advocate for your archives. And that can certainly have some positive benefits for archival repositories. As we've been discussing throughout this semester, when archives engage in really any process, it's important that they're able to measure the impact that a particular process is having. So our social media campaign resulted in, 1,000 people liking this link to our finding aid, and that resulted in a spike in the number of people actually looking at the collection and learning more about the collection. the uses that our researcher services have supported have resulted in the publication of 3 books this year, or have been used in 3 books that were published this year. And the same is true for online access. In fact, it might be more important for online access given some of the some of the resource intensive nature of online access, especially when you're talking about developing online collections, which can be quite resource heavy for archival repositories. So as Punzalan notes on page 63, repositories need more systematic ways to assess the outcomes and impacts of digital access to collections in order to prioritize what and how to digitize. So here we get back to this idea of collaboration, looking at how collections have been used and what they've been used for, and even which collections have been used, and using that information to help you determine how to provide access to your archives materials in an online environment. So this particular quote is connected to online collections and digitization, but I certainly feel like you can connect it to online fine aids as well. So if you see that changes to an online fine aid have resulted in more people accessing a particular collection because the online fine aid maybe has some added description to it, or has a scope and content note that better reflects the nature of what's in the collection, that would be something that you would want to be able to measure and relay to resource allocators as well. The Punzalan article, or the Punzalan quote, talks about how oftentimes repository managers, archivists, and curators must convince grant agencies or skeptical institutional leadership of the value of digitization and online access in general. Archives are constantly faced with the task of justifying what we are and what we do. And while online access might be something that is more understandable to people that are maybe not familiar with archives, that doesn't mean that the need to justify online access doesn't exist. As I mentioned, especially online collections can cost a lot of resources to do, and even more resources to do well. And you're always going to have to convince stakeholders within your archives organization that online access efforts are worth it and that they are important. Having staff members that are capable of doing in-depth description, which translates into more useful online fine aids, costs money. So that can be a very resource-intensive activity as well. So again, you always have to be able to convince people that what you're doing is worth it, and the best way to do that is to show them how it's having a positive impact. Later in the article, Punzalan notes that there's a need to measure impact beyond the number of clicks or other superficial measures, and unfortunately, measuring the actual impact can be more complex and difficult to understand without complicated and intensive ways to measure them. So it's one thing just to say, oh, we had 50 people click on this online collection within the last 24 hours. And, okay, that's great. But what might be more meaningful is to say, and the information that people got from their interaction with our online collections help them understand their community's history, a little bit better than they did before. So that might be a more meaningful measurement, but unless you are investing a lot of resources and really following up with who is using your materials and why, it might be difficult to miss what that impact is looking like, and that can detract from your archive's ability to really evaluate the impacts that your materials are having and use those impacts to advocate for continued or greater resources in the future. And that's something that the Poonzon article also notes, that understanding the impact that online services are having is vital for sustaining resources and supports. It's vital for ensuring and demonstrating that funds are spent responsibly. It's vital for helping push for further innovation and research. It's vital for developing evaluation tools to be able to greater assess impact. So there are definitely a lot of benefits to understanding the impacts that your repository is having. And as we'll discuss in a minute, a key part of demonstrating a positive impact is by demonstrating that what you're doing is resulting in the goals that you have been set being met. It's also important to note, as the Poonzland article does, that sometimes online access, and especially online collections, can have negative impacts. So the example that that article gives is if people have their records placed online and that results in culturally sensitive material being accessible to people from beyond a particular community, or people accessing materials in a way which violates culturally specific protocols. And that's certainly something that you don't want to happen, because this is a type of impact that can result in a lot of uh, a lot of negative advocacy for your repository. The last thing that you want to do is to be the archive that violated the cultural protocols of a community that has already been marginalized in society. The last thing that you want to do is be the archive that is doing harm in your community as opposed to doing good, because that's something that the stakeholders and other resource allocators may hear about, the general public may hear about, and that is certainly not something that is going to result in people appreciating your archive and wanting to support your archive in the future. And you can connect this idea of avoiding negative impacts or making sure that your archive is not having negative impacts by collaborating and making sure that if you are providing increased access to a particular set of records through an online finding aid or through online collections, they are doing so in a sensitive and responsible way. And by doing so, you can avoid the creation of some of these landmines that may well result in your archives not only not being valued, but perhaps viewed as a liability or incompetent, and that's really not something that is going to help your archives get the support that it needs. So to talk a little bit more about measuring impact, so there should be this first stage where you're developing the goals. You're developing what you want to see a result from the creation of online fine aids and online collections. And then you should look at the current services that you're providing. You should look at your online fine aids and say, okay, do these have the features that we want? Are these communicating the contents of our collections in a way that we feel is appropriate and in a way that is going to support the needs of our researchers? Are our online collections structured in a way that is supportive of a variety of researchers? Do they have the features and tools that our researchers want to see in online collections? And if yes, that's great. Most likely, at least to some degree, the answer is going to be no. And so that should result in the creation or refinement of the services that that your archive is offering. So either the creation of an entirely new online collection, maybe you go with a different vendor or use a different service, or perhaps you just work with what you have in order to refine it a little bit so that what you are offering to researchers is ultimately going to be more supportive of the goals that you have for your online access resources. And so once this creation or refinement of services takes place, then that is where you can measure impacts to see if the goals are being met, to see if the changes that you have made as an archive to your online fine aids, to your online collections, have resulted in online access tools that better support the goals that your archive has set. It may well be that you're still a little bit off, and so you have to continue to work to refine and tweak what you have. It may be that you're pretty close, and you're okay with that. It's probably not going to be perfect, but you just have to do the best that you can with the resources that you have. So it's helpful to think about some of the general goals of online access. So again, talking about online fine aids and online collections. So highlighting valuable collection materials, that can certainly be something that especially online collections can have. Online fine aids, if you have collections that are particularly valuable, then you might describe them more thoroughly and provide that description online so that researchers are more aware of the richness of a collection. Support the use of materials. So you want your online access tools to be supportive of different researcher needs, and different information seeking behaviors. And related to that, you want to have online access tools that meet the needs and expectations of your researchers. If your researchers go in with a particular set of expectations and they find online fine aids or online collections that don't meet those expectations or don't meet those needs, then that's more likely to result in researchers not using your collections and not making use of your materials in a way that can be thought of as a positive impact, and not making use of materials in a way that can be used to advocate for greater resources. Another thing that online access should do is it should project value and legitimacy. Again, if you have online fine aids that are really well put together and are understandable for researchers and have some of the navigation tools that researchers like, or communicate information in a way that researchers find appealing, that's going to make them perceive your archive as being valuable. It's going to make them feel like your archive is a legitimate cultural institution. If they go into your online find aids and find navigating through your archives is really arduous and unpleasant, if they find a bunch of blocks of text and jargon that they don't really understand, then that may result in them not appreciating your archives as much as you would like. We touched on expanding the area of use a little bit, but again, both online find aids and online collections can really break down some of the distance, time, and expense barriers that can prevent people from learning more about records and interacting with records. And again, provide materials researchers use to form their own conclusions. So harkening back to the Eric Kiedler article and the need for archives to not really say what something is or say what's important, but giving researchers the raw materials to be able to make that conclusion or that determination on their own. And if your archives are able to meet these goals, then you can create a lot of opportunities for advocacy, which is, as we've talked about in this course, a very important thing for archives to do whenever possible. So looking at consultation, which we talked about before, if you collaborate with researchers and with the public to identify significant information, to identify how to describe it, how to connect it with other information, even to describe the significant properties of records that your archive might be careful to maintain in online collections, that can be a great way to generate positive word of mouth and positive use. And of course, this takes infrastructure. It takes time to consult with researchers. It takes time to learn about what the public wants and what the public needs. But there can definitely be benefits with that. And then once the consultation is complete, that's where you move into the implementation phase, where you are taking the results of your consultation and, as best you can, within the infrastructure that your archive has, incorporating those suggestions and those thoughts into your online access tools. And so ideally, this implementation results in the creation of online access tools that have a positive impact on the community, that support the ability of a community to understand its history better, that allows in archives to understand more about the materials that it has and learn more about the collection materials just within the archive. And the Poonsland article has a really great table of potential impacts, and that's something that we will look at for our in later discussion. And then, as I talked about before, you can take these positive impacts on the community and translate them into an advocacy opportunity. An opportunity to say, hey, look at all the positive things that our archive has done. And we feel like because of the positive impacts we've had, we deserve additional or continued support. Again, if these positive impacts don't take place because archives haven't worked to develop online access tools that do help researchers and do meet their needs and information-seeking behavior, then these positive impacts may be less likely to occur, and that can really limit the advocacy opportunities that archives have. So 3 of these things take infrastructure to take place, but one of them, the ultimate end goal of creating advocacy opportunities, can build infrastructure. And ideally, what you're able to build and what you get out of this process is greater than what you put in. That's not necessarily going to be true all the time, but that's certainly a beneficial situation to find yourselves in, where the time and effort that you put into consulting with researchers, implementing their suggestions, uh, measuring the positive impact that you're having on the community, and just having a positive impact on the community is going to uh, be less than the resources that you get out of uh, those efforts. So just to kind of wrap things up, there is a strong connection between online access and the idea of researcher services. So the idea that you are focusing your online finding aids and online collections around the idea of use, that you are using information about your users and researchers to plan your online access and what your online access looks like, that you are gathering and analyzing information about your researchers. So what do they want to see in online finding aids? What do they want to see in online collections? That you are marketing the online access tools that you have, that you're making people aware of the online collections that your archives can offer, that you're making people aware of the online collections that your archive can offer, and that you really are focused on use, and that your online access is a priority for your repository because of the way that it can reduce the barriers to use and allow more people to use your materials in a diverse way. So just generally speaking, gearing your online access services to the needs of your researchers and not what you as an archive perceive to be the needs of your researchers. Okay, so that's it for our intro to online access. We'll circle back and talk about a lot of these things over our 2-week discussion of online collections and our 1-week discussion of online finding aids. So stay tuned for that. Obviously, please let me know if you have any questions about this, and take care of yourselves.